Hey everyone, BlackCross here. So today we are going to do something a little bit different, a little bit something that I hadn't really done before, and this is going to be the hardest one of them all because out of everything that I've done, this will probably get me probably the most disliked. That I expect this to probably be somewhere in the middle ground of videos that I've made, of people saying that they liked this versus people that they disliked this, because it's like, oh no, this should be way lower, this should be way higher, and so on and so forth. The thing is that today's video, we're going to be ranking the Final Fantasy games. I'm in trouble. So in the past, people have done something what they call a rank system. Here's what it looks like right now, basically the rank system in its entirety. The thing about the rank system though, however, is that it is based on like performance slash story slash gameplay slash everything in genuine. And this was actually most popular during the age before Kingdom Hearts 3's ultimate release, because everyone was ranking the Kingdom Hearts games from best to worst and stuff like that. And while in this case, yes, we are actually going to be ranking them based on that subject, the thing that needs to be taken into consideration is the fact that there are genuine rules to be placed when it comes to the Final Fantasy games themselves. Now, the thing is, I have played through all of the main Final Fantasy numbered titles except the MMO ones, being that of Final Fantasy 7-11 and Final Fantasy 14. Reason that being is, well, the first main reason, obviously, don't care much for MMOs. So for anyone who has played the other two, along with the said mentioned other titles, you can create your own, obviously. But to me, these are based on the single-player RPG games of Final Fantasy themselves. So I feel like this is how adjusted is, and these are based on how I have felt when I first played them, followed by how they feel to me right now, looking back at them. And keep in mind, I have played all of the Final Fantasy games in over 2 years. With that being said, another rule that needs to be taken into consideration is the fact that technically the majority of the Final Fantasy game, specifically the first section half, I have never really played in their original form. Like, obviously, for example, Final Fantasy 1, I didn't really play on the original NES. I played it on the PlayStation 1. Same thing can be said for almost the other Final Fantasy games, with the exception of, of course, 3, which I was only able to play that on the DS, which technically was on the PC, but it's the DS version, if that makes sense. The original one never really came to America, so the only way I would have had access to get to the third one, the original, would be as if I somehow modded, hack, whatever be the case to try to get to the original third one, but it wouldn't be the original, if you get what I'm saying. So we're basing them totally based on what I have played and everything of that nature. So your mileage may vary depending, but I'm playing them based on how I felt when I played them and how I felt based on that merit. And keep in mind, especially like the PlayStation 1 games, like 1, 2, 4, 5, and 6, they basically are the same with the exception of different resolution, obviously, with 1 and 2 being the case of resolution style. 4 looked at kind of samey-ish from the original, I believe it came out on the NES, and then 5 and 6 came out on the SNES. So it's more of what you would call an emulation for the PlayStation 1, back when it first came out for the PlayStation 1, but they're emulations of the original SNES. But enough rambling, let's get into the actual list itself, followed by starting with the ranking system as well. Keep in mind, we have 13 games to go through. Oh joy. So to start off this list, we're going to start off obviously in order, and we're going to start off with Final Fantasy 1, obviously. Based on what I played, obviously this is basically the very first Final Fantasy game So based on what it is, or what it was, it's basically different than how the other Final Fantasy games have been. With Final Fantasy 1, it basically was an ideal structure of playing a Dungeons and Dragons game on a console system. And back in the NES, that was a totally different genre entirely. And keep in mind, gaming was early on, so the ideal structure was just kind of there. It's like the ideal of putting Dungeons and Dragons into a video game wasn't as vastly thought of, really, when you think about it. To see Squaresoft at the time, put together Final Fantasy 1, it was actually really interesting. It's one of those things where it's like, not only did you have the freedom to choose how to create your character, much less name them, you also got to choose how their progression was and everything. By progression, I mean, instead of having like a leveling system where you learn spells and stuff like that, you actually had to buy the spells themselves. And then based on you purchasing the spells of what you necessarily needed and stuff, that's how you were able to attain these particular spells and abilities. That was basically a rough draft for a Final Fantasy franchise when you think about it. Originally this was supposedly a possible final game for the company. That's why the term Final Fantasy was even there, because it was thought to be the final game that they would work on. Ironically, that was not the case. After this game, they were able to survive and continue on even to today. So with that being said, there are a lot of stuff that I like out of Final Fantasy, and it's weird not seeing summons play a big part, because instead of being summons themselves, they're actually like giant godlike creatures. Like Titan and Bahamut are seen in this game, but they're not summons or controllable summons in any form whatsoever. So it was kind of weird to see that particular part of the summons they took present, but they weren't actually summons themselves. So it was weird to go through the early stages of Final Fantasy, but it was definitely something that I appreciate more and more. Do I feel like this would be something that I would go back over and over again? That is leave to be debated. Like, every once in a while, I probably would go back and re-experience the original Final Fantasy game as its whole. But to replay it over and over again, especially right now, that's a little bit debatable. Now, record, of course, not only did this come out for the NES, followed by the PlayStation 1, it was also remastered for the PSP. Supposedly it had an additional dungeon that was added on to it, so maybe that might be a better version to play, depending on who you are. And supposedly there was some more jobs added on to the PSP version. So the PSP would probably be the more superior one. But even still, with the combat followed by the lack of story per se, it also is the first one. So you would think it deserves to be in a forgiving scale. But if we're going to do that, that would mean that we would have to average them based on evolution, obviously. And with that, we're basing them based on their core game itself. So with Final Fantasy 1, I hate to do this, but I think I'm going to be placing that. I think I'm going to try placing that in the B section, rank B. Again, definitely an interesting concept when it was first made. You could definitely tell this was heavily inspired by Dungeons and Dragons, but considering how far we have been in the Final Fantasy games, it is definitely a decrease as to what it is. Now let's move on to Final Fantasy II, and this is where things take a major dramatic change from the first one. So, how do we start with this? Well, first of all, the first major change is obviously it has an actual story. Where the first one had like your basic story of, hey, you've got 4 heroes, their main job is to defeat the ultimate Dark Lord, whatever type thing, but you do run along variants of story. It basically was an actual Dungeons and Dragons type style story element. Whereas Final Fantasy II, however, had a structure story where you have 4 main characters, but they each have not only personality, but they also feature a character building arc story, if you will. With that being said, the story itself is a little different compared to what the first one was. The first one, they were just unknown warriors, where you were free to create them however way you wanted to, and as their personalities, it was up to you to imagine them what they would be acting like to some degree. Whereas 2, however, they actually have personality, based on what you would think as personalities would go, but still to a point they had personality that was present in the game itself. In that aspect, the story-wise element was present in Final Fantasy II. The other major thing, however, is the leveling system. Now, this is where things take a major turn. On the one hand, I really like the level system. It's something completely different that I have not seen present in many RPGs for this matter, and so this was a major different thing. You know, based on how you go about making a character, you basically build them up through various ways. For example, the more damage you receive, the more HP you would get. The more often you attack, the more likely you will increase your attack power. The more spells you would use, the more MP would increase. The weird thing, though, is that based on evasion and invasion, which is basically your dodging mechanic, you would have to have a shield on you. And as the enemy attacks, the shield will sometimes block it, and as it blocks it, it increases the evasion. Accuracy is based on the bow, and again, these are some of the weirdest concepts that was more or less of a, this wasn't a bad ideal per se, but it was very rough. Keep in mind, this came out during the NES, and with that being stated, this was basically the ideal structure of how to build your character. So it went from basically going through place to place, leveling up your character, going through the main quest itself and stuff like that. In this one, however, you're not really leveling up, you're training your characters through different variety of things. And while that might have been an interesting concept, it was a little bit rough. It was very, very rough. Imagine if you were just a kid and you didn't even bother reading the manual. You would have been completely puzzled as to how you were supposed to get through the game, because evasion and accuracy are just as important as your defense and attack power. If you don't have enough evasion, you will get hit all the time. Without having a high enough accuracy, you will miss all the time. So what's the point in having high attack power and high defense power if you can't even have the decency of being able to block or evade, much less have the accuracy to attack an enemy? You know, it's a weird concept, and while I appreciate the ideal of different variety, it was one that I think is probably not heavily liked. And I think that's probably one of the reasons why people don't talk about Final Fantasy II, is because of this level system. Again, it wasn't a bad ideal, it was an interesting concept, but it definitely dawned the age of grinding for stats, as to opposed to grinding for items and money and stuff like that. You're actually grinding for stat building elements and stuff. And so with Final Fantasy II, while it had some interesting concept, it had the same stuff like buying spells and weapon and stuff throughout the game, but these two major change. The story was great, but the stat element hurt it a little bit. I would argue and say that 2, and I know this is kind of hurting it, especially considering how I put Final Fantasy 1 in B, I think I would have to put Final Fantasy 2 in C. Again, it's an interesting concept and one that I think works, but I don't see it being a particularly good ideal concept. It's an interesting one if you want to see what Final Fantasy 2 was like and where Square was originally going to take Final Fantasy going forward. With second one, however, I imagine it wasn't very liked. Okay, so this is where it goes from where we was going based on how it originally was, to where now we only go based on what we had available, being that of Final Fantasy III. Okay, so we're going to try to ignore the fact that the graphics enhancement is going to be different, followed by the voice acting that was somewhat present in the game. We're going to base it on the concept and ideal of how Final Fantasy III might have been, followed by the gameplay itself. It has more of a story element in this one, much like how 2 had a story element. The only major thing that was going on with it, we were back to doing a level up system, but we also had a different setup for a level system. We had what was basically different jobs. These different jobs had their own different level, and based on their level depends on the spell that you not only would be able to use, followed by the spells that you were able to acquire. For example, if you were going to be training one of these characters as a black mage, as you would purchase these spells, you would level up your mage to where he had the ability to use these different advanced spells as well. With that being said, however, it was an interesting, I suppose, different ideal. It was going back to the job setup that Final Fantasy I had, but with 3, not only did you have these different jobs, but you could also change them out constantly all the time, and they would be able to keep their stats. Supposedly that might be in the original 3rd one as well. I'm not sure, but I imagine it would be somewhat the same way. As you had these different abilities and these different jobs, you could keep the stats that was going on with these different jobs, and thus you'd be able to use whatever spells currently that was going on. But you was able to switch them out however way you wanted to. So like, say for example, you're fixing to go into a hard area and you're going to need a couple of white mages, you can switch 2 characters out for white mages to where you can actually build up a better defense, obviously. Where you had 2 other characters that had pretty good attack power, you could use them as a heavy hitter, as a fighter or a warrior, or depending on either a black mage, red mage, or as a geonome. So it was interesting to see the change in how the 3rd one was, and while I do actually like the job system, I don't appreciate it as much as I would have if they were like a character that had their own base stat. Because by having different jobs, you're constantly switching them back and forth, and it seems kind of a, not to say an uneven field, but it seems like you wouldn't, I suppose the phrase, you wouldn't appreciate a fast army of characters with different job stats, and instead you have different jobs that each character can learn, potentially. So potentially you're actually having each character master every single job ability. And I do like the 3rd one, but I don't know if I enjoy it enough to go back to it. So I think with the 3rd one, while it definitely improved from where the 2nd one had the stat building, you went from a normal level, but you had job stats and everything. I think this one should also be considered a B, but also in somewhat of a way it would be also a C, but I think for the time being right now, we'll stick it with a B area in genuine. Okay, Final Fantasy IV. So, the interesting thing is, I originally first played the 4th one on the DS, technically, for those that don't know. Then I played the Final Fantasy IV that was featured on the PlayStation 1, but I think it might have been a ROM emulation type thing, because it seemed like it came out of the NES itself. You can actually clearly feel it, or see it whenever you first played it, whenever I first played it on the PlayStation 1. Compared to how it looked in Final Fantasy Origins with 1 and 2, with the next phase of Final Fantasy with 4 and 5. And the 4th one does something that I wanted in how the 3rd one was, where I wanted a character to be a mainstay a mainstay job character. And while you do get to see different characters with different jobs and abilities and stuff like that, you don't get to keep the majority of the characters in your party, obviously. But you do actually have a main cast of characters, and they each had their own job ability. You had Rose, who was not only a white mage, but also a archer. You also had Cecil, who at one point was a dark knight, but also became a paladin, which not only featured strong attack powers, but also healing elements as well. You also had Righty, who was basically a summoner and could also use healing spells. I can't remember now. It feels like I have amnesia all of a sudden. But with that being said, you had a very well balanced character towards the end of the game. But the story basically played out basically how you would have guest characters, you know. If you're familiar with some of the Final Fantasy games, a guest character would stay in your party for partially of the time, but after a certain point in the story, they would more or less leave your party for a period of time or permanently, depending on the story itself. Basically, this was not so much the first game, because technically in Final Fantasy 3 you did have summons in it. Final Fantasy 4 featured summons. In a way, they were kind of like their own entity, you know, where in 3, they were basically part of the ability itself. Where in the fourth one, they weren't just abilities that you could attain, but they were also their own entity itself. So basically, they more or less went how the first one was, where they were their own entity, their own beings, but you didn't summon them. Where in the third one, you actually was able to use them as summons, but in the fourth one, they weren't just summoned, they were also actual beings of power as well. So it was interesting to see that being put into effect. So in the fourth one, do I enjoy it? I kind of liked it. I kind of did. Do I like it better than the third one? Not really. I feel like the fourth one was kind of missing some things. Again, it could be because of the fact that you do, to a certain degree in the story, you do potentially lose them from your party. You don't get to use them permanently. Especially the older Sage, which basically had more powerful spells. But I guess, depending on how far you would level him up, I suppose that would be like an overpowered character at the end of the day. So, with that aspect being said, I do enjoy the fourth one. The story-wise, I kind of liked it. Which one would I have preferred? Would I prefer the original, or would I have preferred the DS version? Personally, I would prefer the DS version, but that's just obviously. I don't know why, but I feel like I need to put that as a C as well. It feels like there was something else missing with Final Fantasy IV. I don't know why that's the case, but I feel like it could have been a little bit better after how the third one was. You know, how the third one was done, how it was presented, and everything of that nature. The fourth one felt like it was kind of lackluster to a certain degree, but that's just personally me. Now we enter in an interesting segment for the Final Fantasy games. Final Fantasy V basically more or less kind of stayed in that same region of how Final Fantasy III did, where you switch in between the jobs and stuff like that. And as you would see in the game itself, as you level up the characters, they would attain certain abilities throughout the game. But not only that, it introduced an interesting element that wasn't as flushed out, however, in how the fourth one was. The fourth one, it kind of featured a form of story in battle, but in the fifth one, it was obviously shown that they wanted to implement a story element in combat. I actually kind of liked it how the fifth one was. Not only did it have the job system, but more jobs, obviously. You also had the fact that the combat made it a little bit more interesting, especially with that element of humor that they put into the story during battle. Not so much more so in the sixth one, but we'll explain that later on. There are a lot of interesting things that I liked it out of the fifth one. Obviously, Gilgamesh makes his first appearance in this game. I definitely enjoyed it how Gilgamesh was. He was basically a villain for working with Exdeath. Later on, though, he eventually turned sides, but being stuck as an interdimension being, which is pretty humorous when you think about it. I think the fifth one, I like it a little bit better. Where would I put it in the spectrum scale? Hard to say, really. I really like the fifth one. I really do enjoy it. I really do. I would say I think I would put that... And I don't know if it's because I like it that much, or if it's because of the fact that I enjoyed it overall. And I think I liked the job system better in the fifth one than I do the third one. But I think I'm going to put this as an A. in the ranking. I know a lot of people are going to be surprised to hear me say that, but I would actually rank this as an A. Final Fantasy VI. How do I go about starting with this subject? I have heard a lot of people tell me about Final Fantasy VI. As I was basically starting to play through all of the Final Fantasy games that I had never really played, as well as the ones that I have played for the anniversary, I basically said that I had never played 1, 2, 3, 5, and 6 before. And when people heard that, they were like, oh, you're going to really love Final Fantasy VI. You're going to really love it. And I'm like, okay, I wonder why, you know? It's one of those things where it's like, I've heard 7 was great. I've heard 7 was the greatest one, you know. Growing up, I knew this. After being an adult, though, however, I keep hearing that 6 was really great. And so it's one of those things where it's like, I didn't know how to judge 6, so I was trying to keep it as low of an expectation as possible. But I went into it as blindly as I possibly did. Number one being that, technically speaking, I knew about the girl named Terra being in the game. I knew about Cesar being in the game. I knew about him being in Final Fantasy VI. I knew about Kefka being the main villain, of course. But I didn't know about the story. I didn't know about the gameplay. I didn't really know anything else about it. However, though, after playing through Final Fantasy VI, I was actually quite surprised. I didn't realize how much I actually would enjoy Final Fantasy VI. And I ain't gonna lie, I can see now why people enjoy 6. It is a really good game. A really good Final Fantasy game, actually. In fact, I would actually go as far to say, next to 7, this would be the best Final Fantasy game in the series. I was actually quite surprised. Remember how I said the 5th one had enhanced storytelling through battling? This one did it as well, but it went to the next level. And let's put it this way, being on the NES, that next level really helped. It really helped. It put the game in a newer way of how they were going to be doing storytelling for the future of gaming, obviously. For the future of Final Fantasy, for that matter. I really loved collecting the espers, which is basically the summons of the game. Now, it's very interesting because when you first start off the game, you don't really have any spells. In fact, you don't get any spells until you finally get at least one esper, which is pretty far in the game when you think about it. And I was kind of like, wow, when do you finally start getting spells? And it wasn't until I first attained an esper that I started to realize, ooh, I see where this is going. And so, as I got further into the game, I wanted to get more and more espers. And the further I got, the more and more different characters that I ended up getting. And I wanted to experience Final Fantasy VI as far as I possibly could. And to a certain degree, with the exception of losing the Shadow, I got to experience Final Fantasy VI the best way I possibly could. I got to go through and get as many of the different summons as I possibly could. I got to enjoy the story fully well made. I got to experience as much as I possibly could with 6. And much like how I did with 5, I went through like every aspect in order to get almost everything I could. I didn't get quite everything, but in terms of like what was physically there, without having to grind and stuff, I would actually say that I got to enjoy it fully well done. And I do love how 6 did everything. I love how the story element is. I love the battle mechanics. I love the different spells, followed by the different experts that can help you learn these different spells. It was a very well made Final Fantasy game, and I would actually argue and say that this is literally the best Final Fantasy game. So I would put this as easily, without hesitation, easily an S rank. Now we go from where we played through the, what you would call, I suppose, the origin of Final Fantasy, 1 through 6, with the exception of 4, the games that I hadn't played. Now we enter in the fray of the game that I have played and I have known for years. So this is interesting. We're going to go into what was originally my favorite Final Fantasy game of all time, Final Fantasy VII. So how do I go about saying this? So You know me by now. I have been a long-time fan of Final Fantasy VII. Final Fantasy VII is by far my favorite Final Fantasy game of all time. After playing through 6 and then going into 7, I started to wonder if I would still enjoy 7 now, afterwards. I still enjoy 7, I really do, and surprisingly it doesn't really null it. But I do feel, however, the age that Final Fantasy VII had felt. But I feel like there were certain aspects that was not fully told, and it kept bouncing back and forth between how certain things was being said and you wasn't getting a full detail. The only problem though, and it wasn't until I was asked this, because it was interesting, when you consider the fact that Final Fantasies tend to do two things. They either stay by themselves, or as the more things go out now, they try to create sequels and prequels and story enhancements for the main game. I enjoy Final Fantasy VII as a series, but the game by itself, yeah, you kind of have to go with that knowledge, you know. The ending of Final Fantasy VII, you know, kind of leaves you on that cliffhanger. With that being said, I enjoy Final Fantasy VII as a series. I love Dress of Cerberus, Advent Children, Crisis Core, I love it all. But as a game by itself, you can't really enjoy 7 by itself without experiencing everything that Square Enix has actually done, especially knowing what they have done. So, it's one of those things where I don't know where to put 7 at. You can still enjoy 7 by itself, and I would say that it is still my favorite. But after playing through 6, based on the quality that I have experienced out of Final Fantasy VI, I feel like 7 could have been just a little bit better. But then again, it entered in from the SNES to the PlayStation 1, where not only did they have way more power, but they had way more capability of what they were able to do. Originally, 7 was going to be on the N64. And if you had the theory of being able to put that together, keep in mind, 7 was on 3 discs. So put that in the N64, you probably would have had 64 different cartridges. I think 7 is still my personal favorite. I love 6. 7 is still a personal favorite. We're going to put 7 though. We're going to put it in the spectrum scale. It's in between S and A. I'm going to say that right now. But I think I would put the original Final Fantasy VII, before anyone asks, no, we're not going to count the remake yet. The point is, we're talking about how the original one was and how it all builds up in scale and everything of that nature. So I think I would put 7 as A. It's a good A, and it's a close to an S, but it's still an A. Alright then, so let's move into Final Fantasy VIII. Like I stated in my deep dive into gaming video, I stated how originally I hated Final Fantasy VIII. I originally despised it. In fact, I would actually go as far as to say that I would put 8 as an F. That wasn't until I replayed it and got to be more familiar with the Final Fantasy games and be more familiar with the actual combat and understanding of story and everything. How do I go about explaining Final Fantasy VIII? Well, for starters, the way Final Fantasy VIII works is spells and everything, is that you had to do what's known as a draw system, where you would draw spells from different enemies and different bosses and stuff like that. You would draw these different places to draw in spells so that you could potentially use them. And you wouldn't get like, oh hey, you learned the ability Fire or Blizzard. No, you would actually get like a stockpile of Blizzard, Cure, so on and so forth. The other interesting thing, however, though, is that you would junction these spells into your stats. Like, you would junction your attack power, you would junction in your magic power, your HP, so on and so forth. And this made for an interesting stat building element. Almost as compared to how the second one was, but slightly different. You were still leveling up, naturally, but you enhanced your character based on the junction ability itself. Now, what's interesting is that, say for example, you use Fire as your attack junction, it would increase it. But the more stockpile you had of Fire, you would actually get more out of it. Now, let's say for example, you replace Fire with Fire Gah. That increased it dramatically, and if you had a huge stockpile of Fire Gah itself, that would also increase it significantly as well. Is it the best system? And I think arguably everyone will agree with me whenever I say this, not really. the junction system is an interesting system, but it's not the best system that we've had out of the Final Fantasy franchise. So, where would I put Final Fantasy VIII? Again, I used to think that I would hate this game and I would actually place it in the F section. With Final Fantasy VIII, however, I feel like it's a lot more deserving now than what it used to. I used to absolutely hate 8, and now I appreciate 8 a little bit better. I feel like the junction system, however, could have been a little bit better performed. It's a weird balancing act between having the right amount of spells and the type of power spell needed in order to increase these different stats. A quick hint though, Ultima is the best spell when it comes to junctioning different abilities, so keep that in mind. If you plan to build your characters, Ultima is the best stat to do so. So where would I put Final Fantasy VIII? I think I would put it as a B. A very good B, actually. It's not a perfect A, but it's not a C. It's a decent B to a degree. Now let's go on to Final Fantasy IX. Now, I liked it whenever I first played Final Fantasy IX, mostly because I went from Final Fantasy VIII, stopped halfway, jumped into 9 and had a blast with 9, then jumped to 8 and had a drastic time. Record now is a little bit better, but I enjoy 9 a little bit better, and I think it's probably because of the combination of the characters. Obviously Sidon, you had Vivi, you had Steiner as well as your character, you had other characters. The point is, however, the characters are really great, and the system itself is basically much like Final Fantasy games, where how 5 introduced the ATB gauge, the active time gauge. Final Fantasy IX continued that, obviously. The biggest thing that changed, however, though, was how you attained the different abilities. In previous Final Fantasy games, you either attained these spells, or you were able to buy them, or you were more or less able to level up your job in order to get the different spells. With Final Fantasy IX, however, that is different. Based on the equipment that you had at the time, you could get different abilities followed by different spells. This was an interesting segment, and I think something that I feel like I enjoyed it. The fact that you got a new equipment, but you also got to learn a different ability. You know, you were learning what these abilities were, and you were growing with them. Of course, naturally, you had to use AP points in order to keep those abilities, and while you wasn't able to get a lot of them, you were able to get enough to where you could keep up with certain stats. Like, for example, you would be able to be immune to being blind, poison, or confused, which was very helpful spells. You had also different other spells that also increased attack power, either by fighting zombies, birds, monster, plants, whatever the case may be. And you also had their main ability stats as well, like different finishers and everything of that nature. You also had a power-up move known as Trance, which basically magnified the power to another degree. And the story, I actually kind of liked it a little bit. It had the first stage of story, then it had a second stage story, the first stage where it involved Garnet's mother, and then you also had the second stage, which basically more or less explained Sidon's origin story, which was very interesting. Basically featured a secondary world. I really did like the pacing of the story. It was actually really, really good. I would have to say, in terms of story, it was kind of like how I enjoyed it Final Fantasy VI. Maybe not to that degree, but it felt like it was that good in its entirety. This one would definitely be an A rank. Not a perfect S rank, but definitely an A rank to a certain degree, and I think a lot of people would enjoy 9, in my personal opinion. And thankfully, you can get 9 on virtually anything, so definitely check out 9 if you haven't checked it out. Oh dear. Oh dear. How do I go about talking about the next Final Fantasy game? For some reason, over the years, people have seemed to hate on Final Fantasy X, and I don't really know why that's the case. You know, is it cringy? Certain elements, yes, but Final Fantasy X is a way better Final Fantasy game than most people would think. Final Fantasy X, I would say, would be the dawning of what you would call the training mechanism for RPGs. Early on, it teaches you about different abilities. It teaches you about elemental spells that go against other elements. You also have the fact that it teaches you about customizations and being able to evolve your character entirely. Not only that, but it also features one of my favorite level up mechanics in any RPG. Basically a skill tree, or in Final Fantasy X case, the sphere grid. I absolutely love the sphere grid. It is my favorite Final Fantasy mechanic in any Final Fantasy game. You could potentially not only get through your main board with a particular character, but you could learn the entire board in its existence. It is absolutely awesome. I love Final Fantasy X. I also love it because of the summons designs. So Final Fantasy X enhances the summons, and in terms of the concept of design, these are by far my personal favorites. I love Bahamut, I love Infant, Shiva, Anima, I love Yojimbo, I love Final Fantasy X's summons. I love how they look. They're my personal favorite summons out of the Final Fantasy franchise. And I feel like if Square Enix could continue to master the summons designs based on how 10 looked, you would always get guarantee of how Final Fantasy summons was going to be. And it was enjoyable. I really loved the designs of them. The characters, obviously, they're really good. I definitely loved Kimahri. He's my personal favorite. You know, I could talk about Final Fantasy X for a long period of time. But where would I put Final Fantasy X? You know, a lot of people would say, no, put this in F. No, put this in C. I'm going to base it on how much I love Final Fantasy X. And this is a game that I would go back to continuously all the time. So I would put Final Fantasy X as a definite A. A lot of people are going to hate me on that, but it's a definite A. Okay, Final Fantasy XII. We're not going to talk about Final Fantasy XI. I've already talked about this earlier. Final Fantasy XII. So, Final Fantasy XII took a major step in a different direction. It used the basic turn-based system, but it did it in a different way. So I don't know how you go about explaining how the battle system is and everything like that. It was trying to be more action-oriented without leaving the turn-based system. And obviously you have a different mechanic known as the Gambit system. You had the, of course, board system. The thing is that technically there are two versions, and technically everyone can play them. You had the original PlayStation 2 version, where the board was accessed for everybody, and then you had the PS4 version, the remaster version, known as the Zodiac Age, where it featured the Zodiac board, where different characters could learn up to 2 different jobs and have a board set, but they would only have like restrictions of whatever spells they can learn and everything like that. And while technically that isn't a permanent standard, it wasn't permanent. In other words, you could actually have it change if you didn't like the character being in that particular job criteria. I'm not going to deny when I say this. At first I thought I would enjoy Final Fantasy XII because of the Zodiac board version, if you could have learned a 3rd job. I feel like if you learned a 3rd job, you would have had a better built character at the end of the game. Unfortunately, because you're limited to 2 jobs, it kind of hurts the Zodiac version, in my personal opinion. And so, while some people would say, oh yeah, the Zodiac version is way better, I would actually argue the PlayStation 2 version is a little bit better. I don't really want to use the term, but it wasn't as engaging as how some of the other Final Fantasy games have been. Once you get to a certain point in the game where you had enough of a gambit system to where you could put together the perfect setup, you didn't have to do anything. I'm going to tell you that right now. You didn't have to do anything. You know, this kind of dawned from the age from where Final Fantasy XI was being an MMORPG, and I think they carried that a little bit more into Final Fantasy XII. So they were trying to make it to where it was literally a major event. Again, not to say that 12 is bad. It's pretty decent on its own. But I feel like once you get further into the game, it becomes a little bit boring. And it kind of hurts it, I think. You know, the gambit system, it's a little bit too perfect. You could say that it's probably the best relaxed Final Fantasy game, but it's not as engaging once you get further into it all. And that kind of hurts it, I think. It really does. Where would I put it? I feel compelled to put it as a C because of it, but it's not a complete C. It would actually probably be put as a B. Oh gosh, I'm getting to the hard part, you know? I say it's not as engaging, but it's pretty decent on its own. I do, however, like the fact that you can battle the summons in order to attain their power. I actually prefer that. It's actually my personal favorite part of it, where you actually have to fight the summon in order to attain it. You know, I liked that element in Final Fantasy X, as well as the Final Mix version of Final Fantasy X, which we thankfully got because of the remastered version. So I actually like that element. So I think because of that part alone, I think it would be a B. And if I put it as the PlayStation 2 version, opposed to the PlayStation 4 Zodiac Age version, I think it would be a B. I think, yeah. PlayStation 2 version for Final Fantasy XII, which I would be, as the honest opinion, the definitive version, not the Zodiac Age version. I know people are going to hate me, but that's my honest opinion. Definitely be putting it as a B. Oh boy. Okay. I think we have to talk about this next one a little bit, because when I talk about this list, I'm not saying that every one of them is bad, okay? I used to think Final Fantasy VIII was bad, okay? I used to think it was terrible. Now I think it's actually really good. And I actually said many times in the past that Final Fantasy XIII was not bad. It was really good. It was really decent. The excuses that people have for why they hate Final Fantasy XIII is absolutely obnoxious. It's absolutely stupid. Final Fantasy XIII does not deserve to be considered to be a bad game. It does not deserve to be the critique of a bad Final Fantasy game. But it's not the best game. I will say that. In terms of the series, it does have its issues. Number one, it tries to copy the ideal concept of the whole sphere grid system, but it's not as perfect as the sphere grid, as each character has their own crystal leveling system. You also have the fact that the summons themselves are there, but they're not as well fleshed out. I do like the idea that they were more or less Transformers, as weirder that may sound, but it doesn't really help it that much more. The combat kind of hurts it. The combat, I would say, kind of follows the same ideal system as Final Fantasy XII had, except it kind of starts somewhat in the beginning, and it wasn't until I started playing Final Fantasy XIII again for my streaming Let's Play series that I started to realize that I was kind of getting bored of Final Fantasy XIII, which didn't think would be possible. And I think it's probably because of the fact that the whole active time gauge system, the ATB, was on the one hand interesting, but on the other hand it wasn't as good. It improved all of that in Lightning Returns, and I think that helped it dramatically. But, unfortunately for 13, I feel like now it has decreased since then. Originally, I say it wasn't a bad game, but it's still not a great one. So, unfortunately, that's where I have to say it. Final Fantasy 13 isn't as great as I thought it would be, it's not as great as it used to be, but it's not a bad game entirely. Does it still change how I thought about it in my deep dive video of 13? No, of course not. I still enjoy it. At first glance, I would put this as a B for Final Fantasy. But for Final Fantasy 13 case, I would put this as a C, unfortunately. Thankfully, it didn't fall completely into a D, but it did fall into a C, unfortunately. We are almost done. We are almost done with this ranking system. You have no idea how hard it is to put this stupid thing together. How do people do it? Much less with Kingdom Hearts. I couldn't do it. I couldn't. It would be all S, A, B, A, C, and D. If I ever do that, you'll see why. But I'm not going to. It's too hard for me. But we go to Final Fantasy 15. Now, if you've watched my deep dive into gaming, you know my opinions on it. Final Fantasy 15, it is not a bad game. It's really good. I did enjoy my experience with 15. It is not a good Final Fantasy game, however. And I feel like that being explained on its own, Final Fantasy 15, I really really am glad that I've learned my lesson through 15, and I've kind of grown with it. I've grown the ideal exception that I can still enjoy 15. I can still enjoy 15 to a degree, but I can't enjoy it as a Final Fantasy game. And I think if they ever do a number 16 entry into the Final Fantasy game, I hope they learn their lesson of how to put together a proper Final Fantasy game. It is not Tabata's fault. It was a whole cluster frick mess to begin with anyway. So hopefully with this lesson they will try to put together a better Final Fantasy game. But as a video game on its own, it is still really good. I enjoy being able to explore the open world as it is. I got to enjoy the combat for what it is. I got to explore around and have fun. And I got to have a really good experience with the overall story, with the movie, the anime. And for some reason I've heard that technically we'll be getting the book based on the alternative ending of Final Fantasy 15. So that's interesting to see, actually being brought up. Didn't think that was going to happen, because they did make that. It was only in Japan, but now they're going to do it for America, so that's going to be interesting to read up on. But Final Fantasy 15 on its own, much like with Final Fantasy 7, you really can't experience Final Fantasy 15 without experiencing everything else, so it kind of hurts it. But as a game by itself, it is still really good. In my personal opinion, I'm going to put this as an even B. So that right there is my entire ranking system of the entire Final Fantasy single-player number series. I have finally done it. I have done what I've been wanting to do for a long while, and that's to rank the Final Fantasy game as a whole. And I know people are going to be surprised. They're going to look at this list and be like, wow, this is pretty interesting. You really didn't hate a single Final Fantasy game. No, I really don't. That's the thing about it. You know, a lot of people will think, oh, there's going to be a F ranking for Final Fantasy somewhere. It has to be 13. No. In my personal opinion, Final Fantasy 13 does not deserve to be in the F rank, much less a D. It's an okay C. C is what you would call passable, you know? When you go into the ranking system, F and D would almost mean that it's unplayable. Absolutely a hated entry into the series. And really, when you think about it, I don't really hate a single Final Fantasy game. I enjoyed my experience. Do I think one is better than the other? Obviously, of course, all the time. Am I going to prefer certain things better than other systems? Of course, that's natural. But I can evenly say that after looking at this ranking system, I actually feel comfortable describing each Final Fantasy game as to which one I prefer better. Although, if you ask me to do a top 10, you're gonna get yourself bitch slapped, because I can't do that. This was hard, guys. This ranking system was hard. It was even enough for me to do it, but to do an actual 1 through 10 favorite Final Fantasy games of all time, I can't do that! Anyway, though, thank you so much, guys, for watching this video. This took an hour long for me to put together, but I finally got through it, so thank you so much for watching, and I shall see you in the next video, where hopefully this video was pretty interesting, and if nothing else, you got a good laugh at it, based on my reaction of trying to organize it in based on, like, game versus favorite versus what my least favorite is, because let's put it this way, if I had a choice, all of them would either be A's or B's, but I have to base it on, like, which one is, like, really good versus which one is, like, really decent, and which one was just kind of left me in a little daze, you know? But with that being said, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Take care, guys.